Thank you. Super excited to be here. I do have to make a correction because I am not actually a professor. I'm sort of a professor of sociology, but I actually teach in a business school. And so I'm an amateur sociologist, but I can play one on TV. If you're a real scientist, you probably imagine that what goes on in business schools is a lot of research on stenography, something along those lines, maybe bookkeeping. It turns out that business schools are loaded with social scientists. We have economists, sociologists, psychologists, statisticians, operations researchers, and they're all focused on these critical institutions of business, critical institutions of the economy. And so optimistically, I like to think that the business school is an estuary where the fresh water of academia meets the salt water of the real world. But sometimes it comes out just like brackish water. And so I want to tell you sort of the journey that I've been through trying to communicate some ideas about from business schools. The core problem is that the ideas that you can communicate easily, the tweetable ones, are the ones that get the attention. And so if you want to be confident before your presentation in front of thousands of people, you should stand like Wonder Woman for 2 minutes, and then you'll be filled with testosterone and full of confidence. That conveys in a tweet. Or if you're trying to get kids to choose carrots instead of cookies, put on little cartoon stickers and they'll pick the carrots. That one goes really far. But the big social problems are harder than that, and they don't convey in a tweet. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own experience with trying to make social science accessible and to change the debate. And I was thinking, for the purpose of this group, what is the social science equivalent of climate change? Is there something that's a big, hairy problem that's foreseeable, but that we haven't really thought through how are we going to address it? I'm going to say something that'll sound surprising. The social science equivalent of climate change is vanishing corporations. And what I'm going to do is tell you about briefly about a set of findings that I have in my effort to try to get the word out about what's going on in our world so that we can change policy around it, and the various flavors of frustration that I've had about this. So start with the surprising fact. What do we mean by vanishing corporations? So the number of public corporations in the US has dropped by half since 1997. And half is scientifically a lot. So we used to have over 8,000, now there's maybe 3,500. And you might say, yay, stick it to the man, our corporate oppressors are going away. We'll get to that in a moment, but it might turn out that we're going to miss these things. It turns out not to be this single unicausal story. It's not just increasing concentration. There's the burst of the internet bubble, consolidation and collapse in banking, the offshoring of the electronics industry, the big pharma vortex of acquisitions, a whole lot of things going on that don't contain one core story. That's where they're disappearing, and they're not coming back. So the going public fad of the 1990s is long gone. So like parachute pants and Furbies and Clinton administrations, the IPO thing really has not come back, and it's not going to in the near future. The number of startups in the US has been going down for 30 years, and this could be a bad thing that we're not seeing more of these businesses. The businesses that are going public, nobody actually works there. So if you add up the global workforce of Zynga, LinkedIn, Groupon, Zillow, Yelp, Facebook, Tableau, Zulily, and Box, it's fewer than the number of people that got laid off the year that Circuit City was liquidated. So these new companies, nobody actually works there, and they're not going to last long. So you might say, yay, small is beautiful, but it's actually a giant social problem. So one reason is that in the US, unlike the civilized world, we think that it's the job of corporate employers to provide health insurance and retirement security. So at the end of the Second World War, every other country in the world said, let's provide these core social welfare functions to people, and the US, General Motors did it, and other corporate employers. And so our safety net is heavily reliant on corporate employers. You get these benefits by working for a company, not because you're a citizen of that country. So that's weird in the US. The other thing is that to a shocking extent, the middle class in the US depended on large-scale corporations in the 20th century. Upward mobility, the growth of the middle class depended very heavily on stable employers that had career ladders. So if you looked in 1960, the biggest employers were GM, AT&T, Ford, GE, US Steel, and so on. A lot of large manufacturers. 20 years later, pretty much all of the same folks. So they were stable, long-lasting employers with bloated management layers that meant that you could get a middle-class job and put your kids through college. Fast forward to 2010, and these dark blue ones are all service, and it's Walmart, Target, UPS, Kroger, and so on. And in fact, 9 of the 12 biggest employers in the US are in retail, not manufacturing. Could be great, but the career ladder at a Walmart is more of a step stool. So it's not like AT&T or General Motors. To put this another way, everybody that goes to college today would like to end up working for Facebook eventually. It would take 25 Facebooks to make up the employment of one Kroger. Kroger is where people work, not Facebook. It also turns out that it is a lot easier to regulate big corporations and to make them behave. So going back to Teddy Roosevelt at the turn of the 20th century, you can regulate giant corporations, and it's a lot harder to regulate small firms or companies that aren't publicly traded. If you think back to our last great liberal president, Richard Nixon, during his administration, we got OSHA, EPA, Consumer Product Safety Committee, the EEOC got litigation authority, and what that meant was if you wanted a corporate employer to behave themselves, if you felt that the biggest employers were discriminating and they needed to stop, sue the biggest 5 employers and get them to behave themselves, because a very large part of the workforce worked at just those 5 companies. Now it's not like that. It's a handful of retailers with very high turnover, and they're not nearly as big as the big employers back in the day. The last thing that should make us anxious about this whole thing is that a shrinking stock market leaves a lot fewer options for college and retirement savings. So think about where are you going to put your money when there aren't enough firms to be in the S&P 500, where there's only 300 left. So that's a bit of an awkward thing for those of us that can't invest directly in private equity. So from my perspective, what all of this means is that we are living through a foreseeable social disaster with the collapse of the traditional corporation. If you're a nerd, the size of the largest employers, the proportion of the workforce working for the 10 or 50 or 100 biggest employers has a nearly perfect negative correlation with the Gini coefficient of income inequality. So what that means in plain English is that small is beautiful if you love inequality. We can make big employers behave themselves. We can make a Walmart behave themselves, or an AT&T or a GM. It's much harder to do that with a company like Snap, which has 1,800 employees globally. So that's one of the things that we're losing. The decline of the middle class, increasing unemployment. A lot of these, I could show with a whole bunch of regressions, are surprisingly linked to the collapse of the traditional corporation. So that's kind of the core thing. That is the ice age part of this, the global warming part of this. How do you get the word out? So now that I've got this idea, what can we do? It turns out that public policy is informed by stylized facts about how the economy works. So it's not driven by actual economists who do normal economics. It's often driven by stylized facts about how the economy works. This is, I think, at the Smithsonian, the Laffer curve napkin that may turn out to be a forgery. But the stylized facts about the corporate economy are wrong on a lot of fronts. They are the way the world might have worked in the 1970s, but what's really happening can't be conveyed through 2 or 3 simple bullet points. So in 2012, President Obama signed something called the Jobs Act that made it easier for firms to go public. And the theory was startups create all of the jobs, make it easier for firms to go public, and they will create more jobs, problem solved, and we'll have a nice populist solution. Turns out not to be true at all. IPO companies create very few jobs. The median firm from 2000 to today created 51 jobs globally. So making it easy to go public is going to get you a lot of biotech firms where 3 people work, but it's not going to solve the core problem. So it's a big, hairy problem. How do you convey this? And this is my odyssey. So how do you change the dialogue? How do you get policy to be informed about the way the economy actually works these days? So one thought was publish an academic book with a university press. That was the first thing that occurred to me. And that works if you want to convince your colleagues. So after that, I worked really hard to start writing in plain English. And I said, what about if I publish a mass market book? Because, that's the way to actually reach the broader public, write in plain English in short sentences with pithy anecdotes. This works if you want to convince your parents, but nobody else will read your book. And my publisher for this book literally said, the CEO of this company said, nobody buys books, nobody reads books, and marketing doesn't work. And that was his insight from being a publisher, is books are hopeless. All right, these days, maybe people watch television. Maybe I could do a segment on PBS NewsHour with Paul Solman. Everybody watches this. It was amazing. I'm sure 1 billion people around the world are watching this. Did a nice 10-minute segment, and it turns out that this works for owners of vintage Volvos who live in college towns. But those people don't have influence on policy. What about NPR? Everybody listens to the NPR on the radio, right? So I was on NPR 4 times in a week, including an interview with David Brancaccio. And it turns out that things that are heard while commuting home from work have very limited influence on policy. Once people open up that bottle of wine, they've forgotten what Brancaccio was talking about. So I thought the kids these days love the interwebs. Maybe I could publish something there, write something accessible and short for a wide circulation outlet like Yahoo Finance. And I'm saying in capital letters, do not ever do this. And the addendum to this is never ever do this, and also never ever read the 1,000 comments that you get. Because I have learned that people get to the end of The Triumph of the Virtual and start typing why you're wrong and you're a moron before they've finished the title. They certainly don't read to the end, and it'll only make you sad. And I have found my favorite thing. I think we have folks from The Conversation here. Yes, mad props to The Conversation. Yeah. So write accessible. So Andy Hoffman told me about this, who will be on one of the panels tomorrow. He said, you should check out The Conversation. They are reputable, they're academic, they get into the right hands. And then when you get it out there, respond to every call from every journalist ever. This is the way to go. So after many rounds of failure, this turns out to work. Tens of thousands of reads, mostly respectful dialogue, and it really does get into the right hands. And so I love The Conversation. Whoever came up, everybody should fund it. Philanthropists, give them money. They do an amazing job. And like when you see overnight 28,000 people have read your post, that's your quelling. That was really pretty magical. And smart people who then want to follow up and learn about this. So this turns out to be a pretty good way to do things. So I think I might have finally gotten to a place where the dialogue is changing. So in early September, there was an article in the New York Times on the front page of the business section called "To Understand Rising Inequality, Consider the Janitors at 2 Top Companies Then and Now." Compared a woman that started as a janitor at Kodak and worked her way up to being chief technology officer. And she had health insurance, and she had a middle-class life, and her kids went to college. She had a great life starting from a very sort of lower place. And then they compared a woman who works at Apple cleaning there, but she works for a contractor and can't take time off and is a 1099 worker and has no benefits. So I thought, bingo, that's like a synecdoche of my life's work right there. And so I think it is getting into the dialogue. But I want to close with a concern here, which is in the current media climate, there's a lot of incentives to do tweet-sized novel findings. We love things like power pose for 2 minutes, or drinking red wine will prevent death, or whatever it might be. More of X leads to more of Y. And my feeling is that we are now incentivized to do that kind of work, that deans love to see it, press offices love to see tweet-worthy work. They don't like to see things that involve a whole lot of regressions, and my worry is that we're going to be moved to do much more of this tweet-sized work, bite-sized chunks rather than real science. So not sure where to go with that, but thank you.